Welcome to tonight's United Front Radio. I'm Daniela Walls, chair of the Tax Wall Street Party. Tonight we are joined by Dr. Webster Tarpley to discuss the big election on Tuesday, November 4th. You should go out and vote because there is a difference. Our short-term goal is divided government, and our long-term hope is the end of the Republicans and the split of the Democrats into populists versus Wall Street Democrats. On Tuesday, all 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives and 33 of the 100 seats in the United States Senate will be contested, along with 38 state governorships. In this episode, we are taking a look at the Koch brothers' plantation plan for America. The Koch brothers own every Republican running on November 4th. We should vote against these Koch candidates. And we'll also get into the idea of voting for divided government, because you also don't want Wall Street Democrats taking over everything. If the Republicans collapse faster than the Democratic split can mature. The backlash we've seen against Obama in the last 6 years is really a backlash against Wall Street Democrats. If the Democrats collapse now and the Republicans win this year and in 2016, that is hell on earth. That is war, and that is permanent fascist austerity dictatorship. So what can we do on November 4th? It's better for the Democrats to hold the Senate now, keep the Congress divided, and that gives the Republican Party 2 more years to mature into its eventual collapse. So Webster, where do you want to start for November 4th?
I would propose starting with the general historical perspective that we have at the United Front Against Austerity and the Tax Wall Street Party, which is the reform of the two-party system, which would essentially start with the destruction in place of the Republican Party. The Republican Party now a focus for bigots, racists, reactionaries. More than ever, it is now the Koch brothers party, known to some dupes as the Koch brothers, but they're the Koch brothers. The story with the money from the Republican Party is, you'll remember the Citizens United decision passed by the rats cabal of the Supreme Court, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, plus Kennedy, right? They say now corporations can pour money just about into any election they want to buy. That's the reality we face. But interestingly, in 2012, the first presidential election under that system, we had a lot of Republican fat cats, the Koch brothers, Sheldon Adelson, others giving huge amounts of money to Mitt Romney and also to Karl Rove, right? Karl Rove of the Crossroads GPS and these other PACs and dark pools that he had going. And they did very poorly. So the majority of big Republican donors have been shell-shocked and turned off, leaving the Koch brothers. And you've got comments out there where Republican operatives say, if we didn't have the Koch brothers, we would practically cease to exist as a party. And this, I think, shows the handwriting on the wall.
That's interesting. Every Republican candidate this November is Koch funded.
What you're going to find is if the Republicans do take the Senate, they're going to do that as the puppets explicitly of the Koch brothers and almost nobody else. In other words, it's going to be a Koch dictatorship in the House, in the Senate, and in many governor's races. Just a couple of examples. One of the great lost opportunities, right, where the craven, chicken-hearted, corrupt Wall Street Democrats refuse to fight, is there is this secret tape which people can find many places. You can find it in my Twitter feed, right? Webster G. Tarpley on Twitter. There's a secret tape from a meeting between Mitch McConnell. He happens to be the top Republican senator, right? The Senate minority leader, hoping to become majority leader. McConnell is sitting there in a conference with David Koch, and they're talking about what they're going to do. McConnell promises Koch, you put us in power, we're going to use riders, add on to legislation, we're going to use budget reconciliation, in other words, the budget as it comes back from the conference committee. We can do whatever we want, he says. We can do whatever you want, Dave. And among other things, we'll make sure that there's no increase in the minimum wage at the federal level, and we will make sure that there's no debt relief for students. Many people out there have student loans, $1.3 trillion.
The Koch brothers spent many years trying to jockey Mitch McConnell into that position with their propaganda machine. going after him. And then finally he, succumbed.
This is a very scary perspective. Koch is demanding these things. No increase in the minimum wage. And McConnell says we'll make sure that there's no help given to anybody who's crushed by this high interest student loan debt. Okay, so that's what you're getting. For a lot of people, that would already be enough to vote against any Republican.
Why are the Koch brothers interested in student loan debt?
Because they're reactionaries, and they want to secure that monopoly for Wall Street predatory lenders, right? Predatory lenders who eventually the money flows up to Wall Street. Another good example, though, Walker, right? Out of this entire election, probably the most odious figure symbolically, nationally, the most hated person is the fascist governor of Wisconsin. And that is to say, Governor Walker. And you remember what he did? He ran a low-profile, relatively bland, anodyne campaign. And as soon as he got in, pow, he let him have it in Wisconsin, right? No more collective bargaining, no more trade union rights for any state worker, no teacher, no health worker, no nurse, nobody, no more. You don't get to have collective bargaining. So the idea was to break the back of the union movement. And that, of course, let loose the mass strike. Right? There was a mass strike in Milwaukee and in Wisconsin in those early months of 2011. Some people were distracted by the Arab Spring, but this was real. This was real working people, right? This was the beginning of the 2011 agitation season.
Pre-Occupy.
Yeah, Occupy is a fraud to obscure the reality of this. This was real working people,
I agree.
Real blue-collar workers, not petty bourgeois students. This was the oligarchy, the banking oligarchy against the middle class, right? That's what made it so dramatic. There's a tape from 2011 where some prankster called up Governor Walker and pretended to be David Koch, and they talked quite a while. It's very incriminating. You can find this at Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed, where Governor Walker is saying, "Yeah, sure, of course, Dave. We'll give you what you want." It's very damning. So
break the unions.
Break the unions, yeah. And of course, he would have gone on to the full union busting strategy, which is the one called right to work. Right to work is a euphemism concocted by reactionaries and fascists to describe what it is they want. They want to make it impossible to have a union. And the only way you can have a union is to have a union shop where the employer collects the union dues, or at least some kind of a fee, from the employees, from the workers, to pay for the collective bargaining, right, that benefits all of them. No, says Walker. No, says Ron Paul. No, says Rand Paul. No, says the Republican Party. They're saying we want to have only the open shop, only the open shop. We're going to make the Taft-Hartley Act, the immediate post-war 1940s, make that even worse. Take away the rights of more advanced states, be they Massachusetts, New York, California, Pennsylvania, Illinois. No more unions. Detroit, Michigan, no more unions. And we don't care about states' rights, underlying their hypocrisy. You get the idea. The big issues, we've already mentioned a couple of them, right? If you have the Koch brothers calling the shots, both in the Senate, as they already are in the House, as well as in these governorships, you're going to have the dictatorship of finance capital. And I want to talk about that in some detail in just a minute. This is now the idea. My perspective, and I urge people to join with me in working for this, the Republican Party needs to be destroyed in place. It has outlasted its historical function. It is the party of Koch and nothing but Koch, and you will see that. If they get into power, it's going to be extremely dangerous. We might even be looking at civil war, and I'll try to show you exactly how that can come about. So, destroy the Republican Party, but that only solves half of the problem. The other thing, of course, you need to do is to split the Democratic Party, split the Wall Street Democrats, the majority, the Obamas, Schumers, Durbins, Boxer, Feinstein, so many of them, right? The majority. Split the Wall Street Democrats away from the other part of that party, the minority today, but potentially the majority of the whole country, and that would be what is left of the New Deal populist pro-labor Democrats, right? Largely to be found in the House, some pale reflections in the Senate, right? If you have somebody like Sherrod Brown of Ohio or Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts or Bernie Sanders, I don't want to overestimate these people because they are very weak and thoroughly corrupted. But that group, which is demonstrably not the same as the Schumers and the Durbins and the Feinsteins and so forth. So we split the Democratic Party between right-wing Wall Street Democrats and left-wing New Deal pro-labor Democrats. Okay, so that's the hope. We need to do whatever we can to make that happen. If it goes the other way, you have to remember this is a very unstable two-party system. Suppose the Democrats collapse first, then that is a one-way ticket to hell, because at that point you will essentially have, again, the Koch party dominating everything, and this cannot be the best for our country. Now, the other thing we have to factor in, the U.S. oligarchy is composed of Wall Street financiers. They generally have power. Not always, not on everything, but as a rule, they prevail, right? Because they've got the money, and one of the ways they use their money is they control the presidency. The president is generally controlled in his first term by the need to get money to run for a second term. By the time he gets into the second term, the long-standing practice of the Wall Street oligarchy is to weaken the president, pin him down with scandals, with Iran-Contra, with Monica Lewinsky, with all of the things that we've had about Obama. In many cases, with Obama, they're manufactured out of almost nothing. But you get the idea. Even Eisenhower had Sherman Adams and the Vicuña Coats and so forth, right? So this is also long-standing practice. What you have to realize now is that the media orientation reflects that ruling class strategy of weakening a second-term president so that he can't take the initiative free from the general Wall Street control of the money. Therefore, you see Obama getting very bad treatment. People who used to think that Obama was the Messiah now think he's Typhoid Mary, and it's actually it's amusing to see this, right? For those of us who have followed it closely, the idea here is you could approach this election from the point of view of how unpopular the Republican Party is, how widely hated they are. You haven't heard much of that, though, have you?
No.
The media focus has been on how Obama's popularity is low, right? Obama's popularity is at 40%. Well, what do you think the popularity of the Republicans in the House of Representatives is? It's about 20% or something like this. It's about half of what Obama has. But we haven't heard much about that. And in particular, this is expressed also in other ways. One area where the Republicans are not doing so well, even with all this oligarchical media Koch support, is the governorships. You don't hear much about the governorships. It's always the race for the Senate. The Senate is the big thing. Well, of course, the Senate is a big thing, but, you know, there are these 36 governorships you've mentioned, and there's a whole passel of reactionary Republicans who are in big trouble. Walker of Wisconsin could be defeated. Scott of Florida could be defeated. Corbett of Pennsylvania is almost sure to be defeated. Brownback of Kansas is almost sure to be defeated. Snyder of Michigan, one of the most colossal villains of recent American history, has a good chance of being defeated. You're not hearing about
Yeah, this
that.
all sounds like a list of villains.
It's a list of colossal villains, right? These guys should be on their way to Nuremberg, not on their way to any state house, right, to answer for their crimes, I mean. There's that, and then, well, you get the idea. There's a relentless negativity vis-a-vis Obama and the Democrats, and a free ride for these Republicans. Interestingly enough, if you look at the generic House ballot, if you go to people across the United States and say, which party should control the House of Representatives, the answer to that is a one-point majority for the Democrats. Now, that's not going to make a difference because of the consummate gerrymandering of most of these districts. But still, you see the idea of a Republican wave or a Republican landslide. This is absolutely ridiculous. And it's only this tremendous media bias that puts it in. Republicans are hated because of the shutdown of the government. They are hated because of their austerity policies. Anybody with any brains can see that the Republican obsession with cutting the budget and with the sequester, which was, they say, Obama came up with the sequester. Obama came up with the sequester at gunpoint to prevent these right-wing anarchists from shutting down the government and indeed bankrupting the country. You'll remember it was a question of default, not even of a government shutdown, bad as that is, but defaulting on the Treasury obligations of the United States. We were several days away from national bankruptcy for no reason because of the fascist Tea Party. And Obama says, okay, I'll give you the sequester. Well, fine, you can blame that on Obama, and I do in a different way. But for the Republicans to come forward on that is absolute hypocrisy. So,
well, you get the idea from watching the media that right-wing populism is in fashion. There's a big fervor out there.
Let's talk about that in just a second. I just wanted to mention that the governors are hated. These governors that I've mentioned, they're also widely hated. A lot of them are on their way out. The one exception, by the way, Kasich of Ohio, is somebody who was, if anything, more aggressive than these other reactionary governors. But Kasich learned his lesson when he lost the referendum. He got maneuvered into a statewide Ohio referendum. Should Ohio become a right-to-work state with no union rights? And the answer to that was no. And he was stunned. And after that, he began to take stock, realizing that he was on his way to an early defeat. And he then turned around and said, okay, I won't fight Obamacare. I'll take the Medicaid expansion. There are a lot of people who are going to die in these years because the fascist Republican fashion was to say, we don't accept the Medicaid expansion because we think that's big government and we don't like that. And therefore, people shouldn't be able to get, the low-income people should not be able to get a very basic Medicaid policy. Now, the good thing that you've just mentioned is this question of cultural populism. Here's the problem with populism. There are two kinds. One is economic populism. That is what I represent. It means tax Wall Street, shift the burden from Wall Street, from the average person to Wall Street. In other words, the wage earner should get tax relief and Wall Street should start paying taxes because right now Wall Street pays virtually no tax. No corporate income tax for many of them, Goldman Sachs, General Electric, and certainly no tax on their turnover, no tax on buying and selling when everybody else is buying and selling gets taxed. So there's in effect a federal subsidy for speculation, parasitism, and predatory behavior. Economic populism of my brand says, roll that back. But then there's the other kind. It's called cultural populism. And this is one of the most dangerous forms of demagogy in the modern world. Let's take the best – in the U.S. it looks different, of course, right? Let's go to Iowa, right? Joni Ernst, reactionary, wild reactionary, practically a fascist, right? Comes out there and says, I'm Joni Ernst, and I grew up on a farm, and my specialty was castrating hogs, castrating pigs, and that's how I will cut the pork in Washington, D.C. That's cultural populism. Now, the idea is, I'm like you. I'm not an elitist. I'm not a snob. Of course, all of this is designed by Madison Avenue, ad agencies, K Street, and Connecticut Avenue consultants here in Washington.
Right. All of these Republicans are nothing like them.
Well, of course, these people are oligarchs, right? Let me give some examples now. You see this again and again. It's the plain folks technique. Ronald Reagan cultivated jelly beans as a way to prove that he was just a plain middle-class guy like you and me. Mm-hmm. George H.W. Bush, the elder, had a horseshoe pit behind the White House. That was his method.
Ben Sass in Nebraska, walking beans and detasseling corn.
There we go. Then we have any number of others. Scott Brown. This is a great example. Scott Brown is now running for Senate in New Hampshire. And this demagogue got the Massachusetts seat when Ted Kennedy died, he came out there and he said, "And my name is Scott Brown, and I drive a truck." So he had a pickup truck. That was his signature cultural populist prop. And, of course, what he did later on, as soon as he got into office, he became the most slavish, the most systematic stooge of Wall Street, including the State Street Bank of Boston. When we say Wall Street, it's a rather expansive category. Wall Street runs up to Boston easily. And he gutted even the relatively weak provisions of the Dodd-Frank bill, the so-called Volcker Rule, which was itself a watering down of Glass-Steagall. So anyway, Glass-Steagall, sort of obsolete method of trying to separate commercial banking from speculation. A watered-down version of that obsolete bill was the Volcker Rule, and as Scott Brown made sure that was even further watered down. So, yeah, he had a truck. He drove his truck right through Dodd-Frank and crippled that piece of legislation. How about Lamar Alexander, Republican senator from Tennessee, big leader in the Republican Senate, will be, you'll see him, big guy for the prison industrial complex. His was a checkered shirt, a red checked shirt, right? Not a white shirt, not a business suit, not a red tie like many Pauls, but a checkered shirt. We've had other candidates trying to accredit themselves as plain folks by a motorcycle. We've had that. So you get the idea, right? This is complete flim-flam, but the suckers fall for it every time. As P.T. Barnum says, there's a sucker born every minute, and the Republicans have been trading on that forever, right? I recommend to people, look at the concrete economic program that's being proposed. This would extend to somebody like Elizabeth Warren, by the way. Oh, Elizabeth Warren is wonderful when it comes to vague generalizations. We've just had her on the stump in New Hampshire, precisely in this race. She had defeated Scott Brown before. She pretends to be an economic populist, but it's very vague. She says, we've got to stop Wall Street from running the show. Well, yeah, what? What's it going to be?
Yeah, how?
And it often comes down to things like, the contract that's going to take your home away has to be written in large type and plain language so that you know what's going to happen to you. This is absolutely unacceptable. All right, so you have all of these things going on. One or two other, the big thing, the permanent austerity dictatorship. The big question, why vote? Right? All this stuff that I'm saying may be interesting to some, maybe not for others, but how are you immediately involved? Well, the first thing is war. War. Senator McCain, arguably the dominant voice in the Republican Party on foreign policy, an insane warmonger, an absolute lunatic who has learned nothing. He's actually gone backwards in understanding during the 9/11, post 9/11 period down to the present day. You should know before you vote, if you vote for any Republican, you're sending water to the mill of Senator McCain. McCain says if the Republicans take the Senate, he, who I think will take over the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or some stooge of his will, Lindsey Graham or Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire, they will press for U.S. ground troops, infantry divisions, tank divisions in Syria and in Iraq. So 2 new Middle East wars. Vote yourself 2 new Middle East wars. How is it that the media don't take that one up, right? We've got these pictures of McCain meeting with the caliph, that is to say el-Baghdadi, it's all the same guy. El-Badri, el-Baghdadi, Caliph Ibrahim, sitting there, the guy who's been doing all the beheading, who has massacred hundreds, thousands of prisoners of war, Kurds, Yazidis, everybody else. McCain had been sitting next to him saying this guy is a hero. You can
find this at our hashtag arrest McCain #4 ISIS, or our website handsoffsyria.org. All this information is there.
So that, I think, if you want to do something, if you want to make a positive contribution to this this entire election, arrest McCain for ISIS, and that simply underlines the fact that he was part of the buildup of this CIA secret army to the point where we now have it. The point is just like Hitler, right? Hitler was built up by the appeasers in Britain and France, but when he got to be powerful, you had to fight him. And that's exactly what goes for ISIS, right? You cannot simply say, oh, they were created by the CIA and the Saudis and NATO intelligence. Yeah, they were. I've taken the lead in pointing that out. But that doesn't change the fact that now you've got to wipe them out. That's got to end. From the point of view of somebody who's a friend of Syria and who has seen all these people in Syria, valuable people, massacred by precisely ISIS.
The United Front Against Austerity has started a media campaign where people are taking pictures of themselves around the world with posters that read "Arrest McCain for ISIS." There's a lot of people involved.
We'd like to have a complete library, right, from the Eiffel Tower, the Colosseum, the Brandenburg Gate, the Kremlin, Tiananmen, the Rio de Janeiro, everybody. We like everybody in this, the Zocalo.
Yeah, if you'd like to take a picture of yourself with an Arrest McCain for ISIS poster, you can send it to unitedfrontradio@gmail.com, and I will post it on all of our media outlets.
And this is a way for people around the world to get a vote in the U.S. election, which I think they deserve to have. That's one side of it. We've got the promise of a war in support of terrorism from McCain. That's not going to go very well, right? This is one of the ways you could get to civil war inside the United States, because some people will not stand for that, right? That we have to support terrorism, support Al-Qaeda, knock down Assad to help Al-Qaeda and ISIS get more power because McCain says those are the heroes of democracy. They've gone well beyond any rational estimate. In other words, they've forgotten the big thing, which is the moral basis of force. This has completely departed from their calculations. Let's move on now to this permanent austerity dictatorship. Here's the problem. The Republican Party as a whole is demographically doomed because of their inability to appeal to youth, to the black community, to Hispanics, to students. It is more or less the party of older, reactionary white people, but especially Christian fundamentalists, holy rollers in my rather irreverent terminology, and Southerners, right? Confederate States of America nostalgics. So that's the Republican Party. This is a losing proposition as the years go on. Therefore, there's a tremendous temptation inside the Republican Party, since they cannot switch their base, right? They can't trade in this dying or moribund isolated base for a broader base that would essentially include the dynamic forces in the future of American society. They have to fall back on what amounts to repressive measures. And this is what I call the permanent austerity dictatorship. The fact that the media is pitched so far in the direction of favoring the Republicans indicates that the ruling class, Wall Street, has bought in to the Republican scheme this time, whereas previously, 2 years ago, there was more interest in Obama still on Wall Street. You notice that when the Republicans come on television, they're never questioned about this warmonger stuff that we've just gone through, and they're never really asked, what are you going to do? They say, we hate Obama. Vote for us because we hate Obama. Don't vote for my opponent because she voted with Obama 95% of the time. That's really their only argument. Yeah, but wait a minute. What about policies? What are you going to do? And then if you press them, they'll say, well, we want the Keystone Pipeline, all right? You know, a pipeline here, a pipeline there. This is not they're going to decide the future of the world. Tax reform, when a Republican says tax reform, it means tax cuts for the rich, for corporations, and a further shifting of the tax burden onto the backs of middle class, lower middle class working people, and indeed the poor. And then there's deregulation. Let's abolish the National Labor Relations Board, I think, is one of the things working in the background. But it's not very explicit. Here's what
so don't listen to catchphrases like simplify the tax code.
Oh my God, no. When they say simplify, they mean tax cuts for the rich. If you want to make it fair, I can show you how to make it fair, but it's not the way they're doing it. So just turn away from them. But here's the thing. The first element is the limitation of the franchise. In other words, denying lots of people the right to vote. And you can see this. The rats cabal in the Supreme Court has gutted the Civil Rights Act of the mid-1960s, which had placed a number of states, not only ex-Confederates, but others as well, states and districts, under special supervision. The supervision meant that someplace like, Mississippi or whatever it was, could not make changes in their election laws without the previous approval of a division of the Justice Department, which they could litigate through the courts. But they couldn't do it unless they had sent it to Washington first. Now, the very day that decision came down, there's a cascade of measures designed to prevent people from voting. It's targeting the old, the young, the sick, the black, the Hispanic, the student. Keep them from voting. So what do? Voter ID. You have some card that, it's going to cost you $10, $20, $50, $100 to do all the work to get it. Very hard for some people to do. And then there's early voting, right? If you can vote early, you should go and do it right now, before November 4th, because there's a great desire to eliminate early voting by the Republicans. And this is all coming from the Republicans. They're the only ones who want to do these things. It's a very direct commentary on their relation to the American people. They want to strangle the American people. So voter ID, no early voting. They want to make it harder to get absentee ballots and generally harass voters. They want to make it possible for more harassment to occur in the polling place, where some Republican punk comes up to you and says, "You're not who you say you are. You're a voter fraud." And at that point, you don't get to give a full vote. You have to do a provisional ballot just on the say-so of some Republican thug who happens to be harassing voters in the polling place. You get the idea. So you narrow this. The key to the strategy, of course, is you control the Supreme Court. Remember that Hitler actually took power and to some degree consolidated power with very few overtly illegal actions. There were some. I would not say that Hitler seized power legally, because there were illegal aspects. But still, the idea is you try to make it less than obvious that you're essentially violating the law, as long as you have Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, and this Kennedy willing to go along. And God forbid they should add to that group. You can do just about anything you want in terms of voter suppression. And on a recent Saturday, we had the Supreme Court approving the Texas law, which is a racist law. It's an overtly discriminatory racist law. And they say, fine, you can go ahead with that for this time around. Right? We'll make a permanent decision later on. That's actually quite shocking. It shows that the rats cabal is more than willing to go along with this, right, after they did the Citizens United. And the other side of this is the union question, which we've already touched on, right? The principal mass organizations that would be the backbone of a resistance against more overt forms of tyranny and fascism
is the trade union.
The trade unions, right? You need to have trade unions for many, many reasons, to maintain the middle class, to prop up the standard of living, but also because of their political function. This is a structural issue. This does not depend on whether the average trade union leader is enlightened or corrupt or whatever he is. Doesn't matter what he is. It's a counterweight to the Koch machine, right, which is huge and well-funded. So if we have Ron Paul, Rand Paul, the libertarians, the Republicans saying, we can't have any more union shops, no more union shops, so unions are essentially smashed, then that would go to the Supreme Court, and then they'd say, fine, no more unions. So with the voting rights suppressed and the unions knocked out, the Koch money, this influx of dark money coming in, right, anonymous, and also money from abroad, because this money can come from anywhere, from China, from France, right? The one big untold story of these elections is how much of the money is foreign, and how many of these things, like the Republicans want to destroy the Export-Import Bank. Who's paying for that? Who benefits? Well, China benefits, France benefits, Brazil benefits. So let's not go down the foreign route, right? You got to somehow have some idea of a national economy here, and we need an Export-Import Bank. So with all of those things, if the Republicans can control the Senate as well as the House, and if they have a perspective then of setting up some kind of a contest for the White House in 2016, that could then lead, with more Supreme Court justices being pulled over to their side through replacements, right, through putting more fascist judges on the bench. That's your permanent austerity dictatorship. And you can see that it's all foreshadowed in the existing tendencies. Now, some people would say, oh, they wouldn't dare. Well, that is what people thought in Wisconsin when Walker came in Pennsylvania when Corbett came in, Florida when Scott came in, Kansas when Brownback came in, and said, no, they're not going to go that far. I can't believe that they would go, so far out of the mainstream. They claim to be conservative, and yet everything they do is in violent contradiction with the organic evolution of these institutions, right? They're not conservative. They're reactionary, and more than a few of them are fascist, right? Right-wing extremists, and as soon as you get gangs and terror, then it becomes fascism. You can imagine the United States being in the same situation as the state of Wisconsin in the winter of 2010 to 2011, right, when people thought that they had, some of them anyway, voted for a change, right? They had expressed their protest against what was going on, and Governor Walker was preparing this series of measures, right, including sending in dictators, little Hitlers, to run Benton Harbor, Flint, the school system, Detroit eventually, so on and so forth, right? In other words, emergency austerity dictatorship under the cover of institutional continuity. And this is what American fascism would look like and maybe will look like unless somebody does something about it. I would urge people to look at it from that point of view. And notice that there's a synergy between the war policy and the genocidal austerity policy, right? That if you have McCain sending or bullying Obama, of course, a very weak entry, very feckless, very malleable, ultimately. If he's standing there alone with nobody in the Senate, no Senate majority to defend him, Obama's going to cave, I think, at the speed of light. So McCain will be fomenting a war with Iraq and in Iraq, with Iraq, and certainly in Syria and with Syria. He'll be fomenting wars. Iran may have something to say about that, and above all, Russia may have something to say about Syria, right? There's a Russian naval base in Tartus, Syria. Is McCain going to go and attack that? If he does, then the sky's the limit. So if you're going to have a political cover for a war like that, you need to be fomenting mass austerity at home. Actually, the other way around may be more understandable. If you're going to have that kind of austerity, you've almost got to have the hysteria that can only come through a foreign war. So there it is. It's a combination of permanent austerity dictatorship and endless war. That's what you get with the Republicans. Now, with the Democrats, you get various fragments of this, but not the entire package. And the reason for that, again, is not so much subjective, it's structural, right?
So what should people do on November 4th?
If there's a reactionary Republican, you don't want them taking over. Let me put it the best way, though, is vote to perpetuate divided government. In other words, I would not want the Democrats to take over the House of Representatives at this time, right? They might pass some god-awful austerity plan disguised as green environmentalism. They might try to revive the Waxman-Markey cap and trade, right, which would essentially create these carbon permits and put that in the hands of Wall Street and the City of London so that they could parasitize production even more. Mm-hmm. No, but certainly it's better if the Senate stays Democratic. So divided government is our only shield, right? The genius of the founders, and remember, the founders means John Adams read Machiavelli, put that into the Massachusetts Constitution. That became the model for the federal one. The great father of Constitution is not Madison, it's John Adams, and his idea is that the branches are going to fight each other. So good. Let the reactionary Republicans keep the House. You got to remember also, partisanship is not a state of mind. Partisanship is an economic fact. It's when the pie has shrunk to the point where there's not enough for every ruling class faction, where some ruling class factions are going to get the axe. That's the point where partisanship comes in. Lifeboat ethics in the ruling class is another way to look at it. So they fight to the death practically because they don't want to be jettisoned out of the ruling class lifeboat. The only way to avoid that partisanship is to once again restart the engine of economic development, right? The 1% Wall Street sales tax, and above all, seizing the Fed with that $5 trillion infrastructure window, 30 million new productive jobs, and I think as the experiences of this summer have once again brought home, at least 5 million summer jobs for kids, young people who are maybe not ready to get hired. They can't be hired in the normal labor market. Give them preparation in the form of a WPA, PWA style or CCC style summer job, right? So they get the experience of employment, build a resume, and also stay off the street, right? So you don't have these ugly riots that we've been having. So, yeah, vote for divided government. That's the bottom line.
Okay. Can I ask a silly question? I think most people are confused when you say that the Koch brothers are part of Wall Street, because I think that they see the Koch brothers as the worst type, but industrialists.
The notion of a separate industrialist faction ended really 100 years ago. In other words, when J.P. Morgan bought out Andrew Carnegie, right? Mm-hmm. Carnegie Steel was bought out by United States Steel. Mm-hmm. That was J.P. Morgan, right? That was Wall Street. So the leading industrialist. There was a time when Andrew Carnegie and other people like this represented something different than simple speculation, simple looting, and so forth. But that's at least 100 years ago. That has long since ended. And when you look at a corporation today, I wouldn't even call them corporations. These are simply tentacles of Wall Street. Who owns the stock? Wall Street, right? Or mm-hmm. mutual fund company between Boston and Wall Street, right? Wall Street in my larger sense. And Wall Street is now everywhere. Wall Street is not a regional faction, right? It's not, the Northeast against the Southwest. It's crazy. Wall Street is everything. You could even make the case Wall Street controls much of the known world, but along with the city of London. But certainly the notion of a separate industrialist faction is not there. And the other thing is, if you do have an industrialist faction, it could be somebody like Henry Ford, right? Henry Ford, terrible things he's done, right? Supporting Hitler, whatever you want. But he had this idea, you have to have a high-wage economy. This was the one thing he understood, and maybe it's the one thing that we might need most today from somebody, would be you got to pay the men $5 a day so they can buy your cars. In other words, if you have a low-wage economy, you're killing yourself, right? The American tradition is a high-wage economy.
And the Koch brothers want us as the Koch brothers want us as slaves.
The Koch brothers want a low-wage economy. Everything they do ends up being the low-wage route, right? They do not want to have decent wages, and this is simply an economic fact. You have got to have a living standard sufficient that the children growing up in your society will have the technological skills, the material and physical and intellectual culture that they need to function at the level of the technology now of the middle of the 21st century, right? You've got to have that. If you don't have that, you're doomed. And the idea that you can have a low-wage economy and underbid China, absolutely insane. You'll never underbid China, and even if you do, you'll find Vietnam and Thailand and others waiting for you there in the tall grass. Right? It's hopeless. The American tradition points in the direction of high wages, high value added, high energy intensity, high capital intensity, and this is everything that Walmart is not. And the Koch people. The complication with the Koch people is that when you get into these extractive industries, right, oil, which is one of the things that they do, or timber, paper, right, then they think of the labor power as secondary to the oil in the ground. It's why extractive industries have often had a very aggressive rip-off attitude, right? A low-wage, offensive attitude towards labor. Because if you're building cars, it might be obvious that if you don't have the tool and die guys that can build the machine tools, you're going to be in big trouble. But an oil rig, you say, well, any roustabout, right? Any high school kid can do this job, right? There's nothing special about it. You just got to be willing to work under dangerous conditions.
Right.
And again, the Koch brothers at this point own the Republican Party because of the dropout by the others, right? The people, you don't hear very much about Sheldon Adelson this time around. I'm sure he's doing things, but there's a whole bunch of people who went way out on a limb for Romney and got nothing. And that's why Karl Rove is not the force that he was, because he was promising all these wonderful reactionary victories. Huh?
I don't think people realize how much that the Koch brothers completely own the Republicans now.
They completely own it.
And
so
everybody from who
Koch
alternative media hosts would call radical, like Rand and Ron Paul, they own them just as much as they own anybody that would be considered mainstream. Everybody is funded through their PACs, and there's a Koch affiliate PAC in each state that's controlling the Republicans.
Yes, and absolutely, and that will be so. The only thing we can hope for is that there is this question of the Democratic turnout machine, right? The Democrats have a fairly well-organized get-out-the-vote operation, which allows them to identify voters leaning towards them and get them to the polls, right? The Republicans, historically, they haven't had that, right? They claim they're getting it. Koch has put money into that. I don't think they have it. So whenever you see a Democratic candidate rated, right, if the Democrat is running at 45, you can probably add 1, 2, or 3 points to that, depending on the state, and then you'll get something more realistic. The other thing I would add is the question of political oligarchy in certain states may be working against the Republicans. It simply shows how radical they are in many ways. If you look at Louisiana, the Democratic machine is dominated by the Landrieu family, right? Moon Landrieu, mayor of New Orleans at one point. So right now it's Mary Landrieu, the senator, right? So the oligarchical Southern mind tends to go for the prominent family. Arkansas, David Pryor, right? Son of a governor and senator, I guess.
From what you've seen in your lifetime, are we more susceptible to cultural populism now than in the past?
Yeah, of course, because as conditions get worse, the demand for cultural populism becomes greater, and the need of the ruling class. Look, the ultimate cultural populist is who?
Hitler.
Right. Because he says, the name of the Nazi newspaper was called The Folksy Observer. I'm folksy, right?
I didn't know that.
Cultural populism is, I'm folksy. I'm like you. I have your prejudices. I hated my teachers. I want teachers to be fired. I want schools to be shut. Like Limbaugh goes pretty far down this road. You get the idea. So the folksy observer is the Nazi party. So the more you get into this stuff of I share your prejudices, includes obviously prominently racism, right? I resent black people. I resent Hispanics. I'm xenophobic, right? That's one of the pillars of the Republican Party: hatred and fear of foreigners or people who are different. And as the conditions get worse and worse, well, then that has to be ginned up. It's got to become more radical to keep appealing to people. It's no longer, they used to say, I represent Indiana values, or that's not the way we do things here in Virginia. Right? Now it's got to be more. Now it's got to be, my opponent voted for Obama 95% of the time.
It's mostly anti-Obama and anti-immigrants. Is what I'm seeing.
And other things. I mean, they add in whatever they can. It's actually, I call them the party of national sabotage, because they rejoice in the defeats and problems of the United States. One thing you can't let them get away with, this NASA rocket, so-called, that blew up yesterday at Wallops Island, Virginia, that's not a NASA rocket. That's a privatized rocket. That's orbital sciences, okay? This great wave of privatization. Republicans say, we're going to privatize the schools. We're going to privatize the Postal Service. We're going to privatize Social Security. We're going to privatize everything. That fireball you saw yesterday, that's privatization coming at you. That's what privatization means. Predatory executives and stockholders rake off a lot of the resources for their own predatory use, private use, and then what you're left with is something that blows up. You notice they're having a little bit of trouble with that, right? They'd like to jump on it, these Republicans, right, as the population of Party of National Sabotage. But they can't because it's a privatized vehicle owned by Orbital Sciences. You want to know where the center of gravity of U.S. politics is? I'll tell you where it is. It's well to the left of the Democratic Party. And I say this for the independents, these fussy characters who say, can't we agree? Isn't there a point in the center? No, it's not in the center. The economic point of agreement for the American people is well to the left of the entire Democratic Party. Let's take an example. The minimum wage, right? Everybody knows that we now have this terrible income disparity. Federal minimum wage is at $7.25. It's been there for 20 years.
It's okay.
But now we have some referenda on the ballot. Let's just look at some of these. In Alaska, there's a proposal to raise the minimum wage in Alaska to $9.75, $2.50 above the federal minimum. In Arkansas, $8.50. In Nebraska, $9, and in South Dakota, $8.50. Also in Illinois, those are all binding referenda, by the way. In Illinois, there's an advisory referendum which simply expresses what people would like. $10 minimum wage. The Obama proposal is $10.10. The SEIU, Service Employees International Union, and many others, and me would agree that $15 is where this should all start. Now, if you look at these ballot initiatives, all of them are going to win. All of them. Mm-hmm. Alaska, Arkansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Illinois. Now, the first four are red states, right? Those are reactionary states. And if you look at, for example, Tom Cotton running for Senate in Arkansas, once the issue was posed of do you want the minimum wage to be raised, Cotton, even though he's a reactionary Republican of the worst type, says, yes, I'm for it. In South Dakota, same dynamic. In other words, the people who don't support this are doing poorly. As a matter of fact, Pryor, the Democrat in Arkansas, did himself harm in favor. He thought he was going to pull a fast one by not voting on the increase in the minimum wage in the Senate. And Cotton then came out and said, I would be for it. And that's one of the reasons Cotton is still in the race. Right now, 90% of Democrats want an increase in the minimum wage. 53% of Republicans want an increase in the minimum wage to $10.10. And what that shows you is that even in states where the reactionary Republican is either on his way to winning or is in contention, I'd say it's hardly any where the Republican is clearly going to win of these contended states. Well, Nebraska, right? Sass is way ahead. But where they say if they come out in frontal opposition to an increase in the minimum wage, they really pay a tremendous price. You get the idea? Mm-hmm. So the American people want an increase in the minimum wage, and this political system won't give it to them. And in reality,
this is a brilliant observation.
That minimum wage is simply a sort of a symbolic point. It's like a synecdoche, right? It stands for a whole complex of anti-Wall Street economic populist issues, right, having to do with protective tariff, no more exporting jobs. And I'm sure if they realized that Wall Street doesn't pay any taxes, they would want Wall Street to pay their fair share. So I think that shows you where the popular mind is actually located, right? So watch those minimum wage referendums. You probably haven't heard about them, have you? Because that's not the media narrative, right? The media narrative is the Republicans hate Obama and they're going to win. That's all you hear.
Mm-hmm. That's a really, really incredible point. So on November 4th, vote for divided government.
To preserve divided government, not limited, divided. Keep it divided, because the only possibility is if you had a Republican Congress, they would begin to dictate to Obama, and he would cave relatively rapidly. And
so we want the Democrats in control of the Senate.
Going until 2016, there's more chance the Republicans will collapse. Because the goal of this thing is that the Republicans, since they are demographically doomed, if you gain a little bit of time, there's more chance that the Republicans will cease to exist. If Koch loses everything this time around, maybe he'll quit and go home, as so many other Republican moneybags have.
Can you tell us about when this has happened before? When they've quit and gone home?
I told you, in 2010 and 2012 in particular, Karl Rove promised the Republican donors that they would win with Romney. They lost.
Right.
A lot of them have dropped out. Say, no, we're not going to do anymore. Koch is the main one, sometimes the only one, who continues to pay. But eventually, maybe he can be beaten to the point of giving up, right? Let's try it.
Do you know why Koch is fighting so hard for political control?
Because he's richer than the rest of them, right? He's got more money and he's more ideological. Remember, his father, Koch's father, was an admirer of the Italian fascist dictator Mussolini. He was one of the main funders of the John Birch Society, along with the support from the Mormon Church of Mitt Romney. So you think
they inherited this ideology?
They inherited the ideology, and they are militant reactionaries.
Any last words you want to say in this last minute?
Simply that if you listen to this creature, Russell Brand, he spends most of his time contemplating the tattoo of Queen Elizabeth, which he's got on his leg.
His upper inner thigh.
Yeah, right. This character is a very bad guide to U.S. politics. I would urge him, why don't you butt out of U.S. politics, Russell, and go back and fix your Nazi royal family, right? The people who were colluding with Hitler. Or somebody like Prince Philip, who says he wants to come back as a virus and kill people to solve the problem of overpopulation. Why don't you get rid of him? Or Prince Charles, who says not only that he talks to plants, which we can understand, but the plants talk back to him, which is a rather more serious matter. Right? Why don't you take care of those fascist relics there, Russell, and leave us alone?
Well, he's steering attention away from...
Well, he's steering attention away from reality as such.
Right.
And I would, if you want to hear a dialogue of lunatics, you ought to listen to the dynamic duo Russell Brand and Klein, Naomi Klein. They have a kind of a duet on the internet, which is, I think, it's a new high in mush-headed left liberal obfuscation.
Okay, so ignore both of these ends of the spectrum.
Don't even ignore them. Condemn them, right?
Condemn them.
Get them down, right? Condemn them and discredit them, because if anybody deserved it, they sure do. The stuff that I'm telling you what's actually going on, they never will.
Thanks, Webster, for giving us the heads up.
Thank you.
Tuesday, November 4th, please get out and vote. Don't listen to Russell Brand. Vote for divided government and wait out the ultimate collapse of the Republican Party and their eventual austerity dictatorship. Thank you, Webster.
Fight Koch.
You've been listening to United Front Radio at ucy.tv. Have a blessed evening.